Mike Perry has found his true calling. The story of the African King, the Nigerian Nightmare, is an interesting one for sure. For a long time, Mike Perry was literally and figuratively a journeyman in combat sports, as he found trouble finding his place in the UFC, and after had trouble finding a place in any promotion. In his stint in the UFC, Mike Perry was definitely a fan favorite, more so known for his insane personality outside the cage rather than what he was doing inside the cage. Though after his tenure in the UFC, this is where he would find his true calling in bare knuckle boxing. The craziness, the brutality, the toughness, and the chaos was all meant for Mike Perry, who embodies all of those things I just listed. And with Mike Perry coming off of his beatdown of Thiago Alves this past weekend, this makes Mike Perry 5-0 in the promotion and adds on to his domination in the sport. So in today's video, let's create the timeline of how Mike Perry went from obscure fan favorite, journeyman, and kind of a meme in the UFC to the bare knuckle god that he is today and the face of a growing sport. But most importantly, let's go over why Mike Perry specifically does so well in this sport, why he was tailor-made for this sport, and why others who have been more accomplished or more skilled in mixed martial arts or boxing haven't been able to do what Mike Perry is doing. But before we get into Mike Perry's UFC career, a word from our sponsor. The UFC returns to Brazil this weekend for another electrifying pay-per-view. With an absolutely stacked fight card, this is one you don't want to miss. I've teamed up with DraftKings Sportsbook to bring you closer to the action. Right now, all new customers who bet $5 will get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings app now and sign up using my code TJLovesFights. The crown is yours. That's right, new customers can bet just $5 on any fight and receive $200 in bonus bets instantly. Stay in on the action and use your $200 in bonus bets on DraftKings Same Game Parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. Combine multiple bets from the same fight, including total rounds and method of victory. The more bets you combine, the more you can win. If sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy and have the shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use my promo code TJLovesFights and bet just $5 on any wager and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code TJLovesFights only at DraftKings Sportsbook. So let's go back to Mike Perry's beginnings in the UFC. To no one's surprise, Mike Perry's base before he got into MMA was boxing. He had an amateur record of 8-3 and won his first 7 fights in various MMA organizations by KO via punches. He then continued his win and finish streak into the UFC, debuting against Hyung Gyu Lim, where before the fight he had this moment. But in the fight, he let his boxing shine, knocking Lim down 3 times before getting the eventual finish. And again, his brutal boxing would routinely rock and eventually knock out Danny Roberts in his second fight in the UFC. Mike Perry, though, would get his first loss relatively early in his career against Alan Jouban, as Jouban mixed up his striking and didn't get into the boxing firefights Mike Perry thrives in, and just gave Mike Perry a lot of problems in the southpaw stance. And from here, Mike Perry's UFC record would be very wishy-washy, and this is where we would see his journeyman career really take shape. He had 2 more KO wins against Jake Ellenberger and Alex Reyes, where he earned performance of the night, but followed those 2 wins up with decision losses. He would then bounce back with a great fight and win against Paul Felder, who he bloodied with giant punches and even showed some great takedowns in this fight too. This would lead to a fight with legend Cowboy Cerrone, but unfortunately for our hero, Mike Perry would get dismantled in this fight when it came to the grappling. Not a lot happened in the stand-up, a lot of clinching and framing from the two, but the dynamic of this fight would soon change when Mike Perry brought this fight to the ground with a trip, but couldn't control his top position, as Cowboy easily reversed this position. But as Mike Perry got out, Cowboy still held on to Mike Perry's arm and eventually got the armbar, exposing the limitation to Mike Perry's game. And Mike Perry's career would continue to shape out like a traditional journeyman with some wins and some losses, but unfortunately for Mike Perry, more losses than wins. He had solid wins over Alex Oliveira and Mickey Gall, where again he shined with his pressure and boxing, but had tough losses with an exceptionally bad one against Jeff Neal, where he got high kick and TKO'd. Towards the end of his UFC career, he made a really strange decision to have his girlfriend basically be the only person in his corner. Yeah, that's no coaches, sometimes literally just his girlfriend encouraging him in his corner, which actually did work in the Mickey Gall fight, but did not work for the Means fight. And though Mike Perry added some actual MMA coaches for his fight with Daniel Rodriguez along with his girlfriend, still, it wasn't enough to get the job done. And by this point, a lot of fans thought this was the end for Mike Perry in terms of his fighting career. Mike Perry was a huge meme in the UFC world, sometimes showed out with violent boxing and actually some explosive takedowns, but it was clear that he didn't have a bag outside of those skills and got technically beat down by the top contenders at welterweight. Again, Mike Perry got his name in the fighting world mostly for having some of the funniest and most insane moments in the UFC, but was never known for being a top contender, let alone a potential champion. After his UFC career, Mike Perry would then make a weird detour to Triad Combat, a short-lived fighting promotion that tried to make a rule set to make fights between boxers and MMA fighters a little more competitive. For some reason, they fought in a triangle, but the rule set was kind of cool. They used gloves closer to MMA gloves, which allowed for more forms of grappling and clinching, and all punches were allowed, which included spinning back fists and hammer fists. Mike Perry, in his Triad Combat fight with professional boxer Michael Seals, heavily utilized the ability to use under and overhooks as he kept this fight mostly in the clinch, deep in the pocket. And though Michael Seals dropped him with a left hook off the ropes, Mike Perry was able to rally a victory in this dogfight. Though with Triad Combat being short-lived, it was time for Mike Perry to find a new home, and this next one really suited him. Mike Perry made his bare knuckle debut against Julian Lane, who was actually, relative to how new the promotion was, a veteran in the sport with 6 fights in the promotion, albeit he was 2-4 in those fights. And if the name Julian Lane doesn't ring a bell, I hope this voice clip does.
Bang, man!
Anyways, for Mike Perry, I would say this was a really tough guy to debut against. Mike Perry was going into a completely new sport against someone who has already been acclimated to the new rules and is just as crazy as him, if not more crazy. But despite those obstacles, Mike Perry immediately got used to the new sport and right out the gate practically knocked down Julian Lane with a big right hand. And from here, the boys would continue to bang with both guys landing big and cutting each other frequently. And after a tough fight, Mike Perry, of course, would get this fight through decision and start a new era for the Nigerian Nightmare. Now we get to a much closer and maybe controversial one. Bellator legend and now UFC fighter MVP briefly made the transition to bare knuckle in between that time and debuted against none other than Mike Perry. And in the opening round, surprisingly, Mike Perry was able to catch the elusive MVP with a giant right hand that sent him to the ground immediately. And after that round, MVP started doing what he does best, which is hit and not get hit, and all of those hits went to Mike Perry's dome. By the end of the third round, Mike Perry looked like a chipmunk after eating all of those shots, and Mike Perry, I guess numbers-wise, kept it close with inside body shots, but MVP definitely landed the larger, cleaner shots. But by the end of the 5 rounds, this was officially ruled a draw, which I could kind of see if you gave that close 5th round to Mike Perry along with the first round where he got the knockdown in 10-8. But the cool thing about bare knuckle apparently is that they go into overtime in the event of a draw. Though in this round, MVP definitely started to fade while Mike Perry continued to push forward and land big, and I think decisively beat MVP in this last round to take the fight overall. Though these next fights for Mike Perry left no questions. His next fight with Luke Rockhold didn't start the greatest for him, with Luke Rockhold rocking him with a giant left hand and a couple big shots. The second round, Mike Perry came in and put that pressure on Luke Rockhold, landing big to the body and head until somewhere in this sequence, Mike Perry landed and knocked out Luke Rockhold's tooth, and Luke said fuck this, leading to him quitting and Mike winning the fight. Mike Perry's next fight with Eddie Alvarez kind of played out the same. Eddie Alvarez was landing clean and at volume, consistently hitting Mike to the head and easily got the first. But in the second, Mike Perry kept walking forward like the Terminator and put Eddie in the pressure cooker like his other opponents, rallying a bigger second round. Though between the second going into the third, Eddie told his corner that he couldn't see and thus this fight was called off, giving Mike Perry his 4th win. And finally and most recently, Mike Perry made quick work of Thiago Alves with a devastating left hook to the chin that took out his legs, and when he got back up, he couldn't continue. Fight was called off, adding another win to Mike Perry's undefeated bare knuckle record. So after going through all of Mike Perry's career from the UFC to bare knuckle boxing and watching practically all of his professional fights, what have I learned? It's pretty obvious. but his fighting style, his body, which I'll get into shortly, and of course his crazy personality is just tailor-made for this sport. Mike Perry's style of fighting in general is clearly boxing based, but particularly where Mike Perry thrives in is firefights where his opponent is willing to only punch and bang. As good of a boxer as Mike Perry is, and I've seen some sparring footage where he can be slick, I don't think Mike Perry would be as effective in traditional boxing where the gloves are bigger and allow fighters to be more slick and more evasive than bare knuckle. With the larger, smoother surface a boxing glove provides, this allows fighters to catch and even shoulder roll in the pocket, meaning fighters don't necessarily have to bang in close distances. This aspect of boxing is practically non-existent in bare knuckle. Trying to catch or shoulder roll a fist in this sport would probably hurt significantly and be much harder to pull off. This means when you enter Mike Perry's world, which you will always enter, the best way to defend yourself is either to clinch, where Mike Perry is really good at utilizing to his advantage, or to bang back, which is a world Mike Perry thrives in. And Mike Perry thrives in this world not only because he lands big shots, but also because he takes big shots as well. Mike doesn't have the best head movement in these fights, but I think that kind of works to his advantage. I don't know how many of you guys have punched a straight skull with no gloves, but that shit hurts. And for Mike Perry's opponents to consistently hit what I think is actual platinum, that has to deter a person's confidence. You can tell Luke Rockhold was feeling it in their fight, as every time he got hit, it hurt like a bitch, and every time he landed on Perry's platinum head, it probably hurt too. And that's the thing, it's really hard to condition your hands for bare knuckle. I would assume fighters aren't sparring bare knuckle, so their first fight is likely the first time they would feel what it's really like to consistently hit a person's skull. And I think that shock of bare knuckle fighting, where getting hit and hitting hurts as well, often leads to even veteran fighters quitting, which leads to that last and final point. Mike Perry's crazy, tough, and gritty personality allows him to simply outgrit his opponent. Mike Perry has fought plenty of guys that are more skilled and more accomplished than him, but none of them were crazier, tougher, or grittier than Mike Perry. Oftentimes in his bare knuckle fights, Mike Perry gets tagged up a lot and loses most of the rounds just to outlast his opponents and eventually get the win. And in the rare moments he does fight someone as crazy and tough as him, that's simply where he's just better than them. Mike Perry strikes the perfect combination of craziness, grit, and skill, which I haven't seen out of another fighter, and I'm just really happy for Mike Perry to have this type of resurgence in this part of his career. But anyways, what do you guys think about bare knuckle? Do you like it? Do you hate it? I personally really enjoy this sport after watching a lot of Mike Perry and bare knuckle fights in general. And with Conor's new ownership or part ownership, I think this sport's going to grow even further. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Peace.